Grant, and I'm a senior at LIU Global. In the fall of 2020, I was able to conduct this case study looking at Indigenous film and filmmakers and how their work can be used for decolonization. And I was advised by Marcel Townsend Cross. So I looked at different types of films. So dramas, horrors, and science fiction films and documentaries made by Indigenous and non-Indigenous filmmakers about Indigenous peoples. I interviewed Indigenous filmmakers and producers, and I was able to attend various Indigenous film events that were virtual due to COVID, which I wouldn't have been able to attend without that happening. So that was nice. So I particularly looked at how film has been created and funded by the victors of history and those who represent the interests of the dominant culture at the expense of Indigenous peoples, and how they spoke back to those particular representations. Through that, I discovered four distinct themes. So first, that films made by non-Indigenous peoples were often homogenize their cultures, dehumanize them, sexualize their women, and romanticize their culture. And then as a result, kind of, already informing like the dominant culture and their views on Indigenous people. It resulted in invisibility in the media, low self-esteem for Indigenous children who felt they didn't fit into that narrative or mold of what an Indigenous person was represented like on media, cultural appropriation, and the films also enhanced or enforced the high rates of sexual assault that Indigenous women face. Despite this, Indigenous filmmakers are speaking back to power through their work, which emerged as a result of the creation of the digital camera and more accessibility to video equipment. And it's found that provides opportunities for women empowerment because a lot of female Indigenous filmmakers have a decolonial and anti-patriarchal point of view in their work. It helps humanize and educate the general public about Indigenous peoples and the struggles they're facing. And then specifically the science fiction and horror genre allowed Indigenous people to envision, and through their work, envision or create a world where they're not held back by the barriers of colonialism. So they can create fully realized character, plots, and development without having to prioritize the white gaze in their work. Despite this, Indigenous filmmakers still face various barriers. This includes the lack of funding from producers and production houses. There's a conflict between elders and storytellers and what stories can be told outside of their tribe and to non-Indigenous peoples. And they're still unable to tell the stories that they want because of an expectation of what Indigenous content looks like. Despite this, however, Indigenous works can be used to educate non-Indigenous audiences about Indigenous cultures and the systemic oppression they face, while also providing an outlet for Indigenous peoples to exert their agency over their own representations. And then they've also, to combat those barriers that I previously mentioned, they've also created Indigenous-led spaces and funding houses to help foster more Indigenous filmmakers to participate in the arts and film. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can email me and I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Aliyah? Aliyah, yay. We understand you're extending your research this semester by also looking at work by African-American, Black, African diasporic filmmakers. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah.
And then we also have another question. Maybe you can answer that in the chat from Margaret.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, this semester I'm looking particularly at that intersection between Black film and Indigenous film. And despite both films, like both cultures of film responding to those, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous representations, Black film had that era during the Jim Crow era where they were able to make films for Black community, all Black producers, a whole Black audience. And so seeing that transition from film made particularly for their community to now the Black exploitation era films of the 70s to Tyler Perry films to now films like Get Out, there's a different trajectory opposed to Indigenous film. And so despite having similarities in the content that they discuss, they do it stylistically in a very different way. So that's what I've been researching. And then, yeah, I can just give some titles in the chat.
Well, thank you so much again, Aliyah, and please don't neglect to put your email there also.